Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. So continuing with our course on the Mukhtasar al-Quduri. In this lesson, we are going to be looking at the congregational prayer, and if time permits, the disliked actions of prayer as well. The congregational prayers, of course, it's a fascinating chapter in terms of the legal principles that underpin it, and of course, it's particularly relevant for us today, given the closure of the masajid, and people have a lot of questions regarding praying in jama'ah and the ruling of that prayer, the ruling of praying in the masajid specifically, the ruling of praying at home, and so forth. And so this is a relevant section for us in our everyday lives, but particularly it's become quite pronounced today as well. We'll dive straight into the book again. Imam al-Quduri begins by stating, ومن أراد الدخول في صلاة غيره يحتاج إلى نيتين نية الصلاة ونية المتابعة. So Imam al-Quduri begins by stating that whoever wishes to enter into the prayer of another person, then he requires two intentions. Firstly, an intention to pray, and secondly, an intention to follow. We took previously that when it came to an individual who was praying alone, he required an intention to pray. And that was either a specific intention in terms of, I am praying the dhuhr of today, or it could be an unconditional intention, such as simply I am praying. And depending on the type of prayer that you are performing, you are required to have a specific type of intention. And so we took that. Essentially, this issue returns to this topic governing principle that we have, which is that following someone in prayer is essentially building one prayer or on the tahrima of another individual. And so what you're effectively doing is you're deciding to anchor your prayer to the prayer of someone else. And the imam, in this way, your tahrima becomes attached to his tahrima in a way where you are now obliged to follow him, and the status of your prayer is dependent on the status of his prayer. And we'll take more details regarding this principle in the upcoming slides. But this is something additional to the prayer itself, right? This is something additional to simply the act of praying. Now, deciding on following another person in prayer and anchoring your prayer to his. And so this requires, in order for you to do that, this requires an actual intention. You need to actually specify that I'm intending to follow this individual and attach my prayer to his. And so this is why a second intention is needed. There's some details regarding the intention is valid and what intention is not valid. So the ulama mentioned these various scenarios. They'll say things like, well, if you intended the obligation of the time, so it's dhuhr time is in, and you intend, I am performing the prayer that is obligatory upon me in the current time, and I'm intending to follow the imam, then this is fine. If you intend, I'm commencing the prayer of the imam, right? Or I'm commencing in the prayer of the imam, then this is fine too. If you intend that I'm following the imam in his salah, then this is fine too. Then you have the question of, well, what if you simply intend I'm following the imam, and you don't specify a prayer? You do not specify that this is the prayer that you're performing is the prayer of the current time. These are essentially legal details, right? These are legal details, and for the most part, if you are standing behind the imam and saying Allahu Akbar and entering into his prayer, you have an idea or an intent to actually enter into a prayer, and your intention is usually present there. So these legal details shouldn't be a cause of misgivings, but nonetheless, as students of Islamic law, these are scenarios that help us flesh out how the fuqaha were thinking. And so a topic governing principle over here is that essentially the intention to follow is required in all congregational prayers, where praying in congregation is not a condition. So this will not apply to the Friday or Eid prayers, because for the validity of the prayer. The dhuhr prayer, it's not a condition, right? Dhuhr you can pray alone, or you can pray in congregation, and that is why you actually need to make an intention for the congregational prayer, because you have a choice, and the intention basically separates between whether you are praying alone as a single individual, or whether you are praying in congregation. You have an intent regarding the type of prayer you are performing. Again, for the most part, these are very straightforward rules, and the legal details should not be cause for any doubts or misgivings regarding the status of our prayers. And these are legal details that we don't really need to teach the awam because it generally confuses them. But for students of knowledge, it can be beneficial and insightful in the meat of this chapter. So Imam al-Quduri says, "Wal-jama'atu sunnatun mu'akkadatun." The jama'ah, the congregational prayer, is a confirmed sunnah. And most Hanafi jurists, what they say is that it is at the level of being a wajib. So it's we've mentioned previously on a number of occasions that when we talk about things emphasized or confirmed sunan, that might be closer to something that is mustahab, and then you have other sunan that are closer to being on the level of a wajib. And so we've taken examples of this in the past. The witr, for example, with the sahibain, they called it a sunnah, but the way they describe it, it's almost at the level of being tarkuha, is what they say. Similarly, with the tashahhud, the ulama who phrased it or expressed it as being a sunnah, at the same time obligated a sujood sahu for it, and so they intended it to be pretty much at the level of being a wajib. And so the jama'ah in the Hanafi school is considered a confirmed sunnah at the level of being a Prophet ﷺ, his teachings regarding the congregational prayer and what he expressed regarding people who at least make it a habit not to attend the mosque or not to pray in congregation. What he said regarding them was quite severe, and it was something that you do not find this type of emphasis from the Prophet ﷺ for emphatic in terms of how he felt when it came to individuals who were being lax in attending the congregation. And so in this hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ, he said that I had in mind to order firewood to be collected, an amura bihatabin, right? Then for firewood to be collected, then to order the prayer to be called, and to appoint a man to lead the people in prayer, and then come up behind certain men and burn their houses down about them. Bukhari and Muslim. And so this is a very strong wa'id or warning from the Prophet ﷺ regarding how he felt about individuals who did not attend the jama'ah without an excuse. Emphatic about the sunnah nature of the congregational prayer. Now, the congregational prayer, it can be fulfilled validly at home as well. It is optimal to go to the masjid, but there were many ulama who deemed this to be a fadila to do so in the masajid, and they said that the sunnah is fulfilled by praying in congregation at the home, even though it is optimal for men to actually go to the masjid if they are able to, if the masjid is within a particular distance and easy to reach, and they do not have any excuses, there's no impediments to their reaching the masjid without difficulty, and various other conditions. But generally, we should all be trying to perform the jama'ah in our own homes if we are unable to go to the masajid. And especially, during these times when the masajid are unfortunately closed, then this is a period where we should be even more emphatic about the need for our homes to be places where the jama'ah is established, because there is there is a delegation of Muslims coming together to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is something that we should maintain. And optimally, it is maintained in the masajid, but because we do not have access to the masajid currently, we should at least ensure that this warning of the Prophet ﷺ and the do not perform prayer in congregation, that this is not something that we are falling into, that this is not a warning that we are falling into, and that we are taking the means to ensure that we at least pray in congregation in our homes with our families and others if we are able to. So it's a very important sunnah of Islam, and there are reports from and people would not do inkar of them. Originally, the Imam al-Tahawi mentions that the prophetic rule was that someone who prayed at home and then came to the masjid and witnessed the prayer would have to re-pray. And Imam al-Tahawi mentions several hadith in this regard in Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, but this was considered to be mansukh, and afterwards some of the Sahaba would pray at home and then come to the masjid and simply watch other people performing prayer, and the other ashab of the Nabi and the Prophet himself would not do any inkar of this. So it indicates that praying in the home is considered valid and it is not always blameworthy, and so we should at least fulfill that minimum when it comes to the congregational prayer with our families and others. It is most optimal to lead the people in prayer. And he says, وَأَوْلَى النَّاسِ بِالْإِمَامَةِ أَعْلَمُهُمْ بِالسُّنَّةِ فَإِن تَسَاوُوا فَأَقْرَأُهُمْ لِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَإِن تَسَاوُوا فَأَوْرَعُهُمْ فَإِن تَسَاوُوا فَأَسَنُّهُمْ. So the most preferable person for leading the prayer is the one who is most knowledgeable. If equal in this respect, cited in the Qur'an, if equal in this respect, then the most scrupulous of them, and if equal in this respect, then the eldest of them. Now over here, there are three essential principles that we can mention over here. One relates to the validity of praying behind someone, and the second relates to what is so when it comes to validity, the principle is very straightforward. Every individual whom another can validly follow in prayer, that is build his tahrima upon, is suitable to serve as an imam for him in that prayer. It's fairly straightforward. If you can build your tahrima validly upon the prayer of another person, then it is valid for that person to serve as your imam. As for recommendation, then we have two principles over here. Both are interrelated in a way. The first is that the imama is based on what is superior and most perfect. Right? It is based on superiority, afdaliyah, and what is most perfect, or akmal. And this was stated by Imam al-Kasani. Imam al-Quduri expressed a different principle, which is related actually to al-Kasani's principle. Imam al-Quduri says that it is recommended will lead to a greater congregation, right? And the reason why these two principles can be seen as interrelated is because when the imama is based on what is based on superiority and what is most perfect, then this naturally attracts a greater congregation. And we've taken this issue of trying to ensure a greater congregation in the past. Our goals of the Sharia and the ahkam we see in the Sharia to try and get out as many a number of Muslims as possible to come to the congregational prayer, and not to implement any rule that would discourage people from attending the congregational prayer. We've taken several ahkam related to this principle, and the ahkam related to who you appoint as the imam, who is most optimally appointed as the imam, also revolves around this specific consideration. Now, this order that Imam al-Quduri mentions, it is found in some form in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ in Sahih, the person who should lead the qawm is who? The first is aqra'hum li kitabillahi ta'ala. The one most versed in the book of God should lead people in prayer. فَإِنْ كَانُوا فِي الْقِرَاءَةِ سَوَاء فَأَعْلَمُهُمْ بِالسُّنَّةِ. If equally versed, then the one most knowledgeable of the Sunnah. And if they are equal in their knowledge of the Sunnah, فَأَقْدَمُهُمْ هِجْرَةً, then the one who emigrated first. And if equal in the one who accepted Islam first, فَأَقْدَمُهُمْ سِلْمًا. And in some riwayat, this consideration of who accepted Islam first is replaced by the one who is elder. فَأَقْدَمُهُمْ سِنًّا or فَأَكْبَرُهُمْ سِنًّا. It is replaced by the one who accepted Islam first. And this riwayah is in Sahih. The interesting thing is the order of the hadith is not the same as what we mentioned, what Imam al-Quduri mentions. The hadith begins with someone who is most versed in the recitation of the Qur'an. Imam al-Quduri begins with someone who has most ilm of the Sunnah. And the reason given by the Hanafis, Imam Muhammad is explicit on this, that the reason why they sort of relegate فَأَقْرَأُهُمْ لِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى, the reason why they put this at number 2 while in the hadith it's at number 1 is because they say that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the individual who was most versed in the Qur'an was usually also either the most learned, or he was someone who knew the fiqh of salah, right? But meanwhile, Imam Muhammad said, in our times, you can have great tajweed, you can have great qira'ah, you can have memorized the Qur'an, but you may be lacking in your fiqh. You might not know the fiqh of salah in the way that you should. And so this is why the Hanafis placed the ilm of the Sunnah at the top of the list and made qira'ah, or a person's versedness in the Qur'an, at tier 2. And this reasoning that I mentioned is mentioned in Kitab al-Athar of Imam Muhammad. And so we'll take each of these one by one. So the most knowledgeable of the Sunnah. What does this mean? Specifically, this means the Sunnah in rulings that are related to the prayer. Right? The Sunnah in rulings that are related to the prayer. So someone who has knowledge of the Sunan associated with the prayer and the fiqh associated with the prayer is given precedence to all others when it comes to being the imam. And the legal rationale behind this is because being most versed in the Qur'an, whether it's in terms of tajweed or memorization, this basically relates to a single rukn or integral of the prayer, right? Which is qira'ah. While being learned in the Sunnah relates to the entire prayer. Right? When you're learned in the Sunnah, you know the Sunan of ruku', of sujood, of qira'ah, you know the Sunan of sitting, you know the Sunan of forgetfulness, prostration, if you make a mistake, and so on and so forth. So it relates to the entire prayer. And so this returns to the first topic governing principle, which is that the imamah is based on what is akmal. And the one who is most knowledgeable of the Sunnah has a kamal that the one who simply knows the Qur'an does not. And subsequently, when the imam is someone who is knowledgeable of the prayer in this way, then this will attract more people and give them more confidence in terms of following him in their prayers. But the scholars do mention that this category of persons, the one who knows more of the Sunnah, to give him preference when it comes to being the imam, there are two conditions that need to be kept in mind. One is properly. So he has the ability, he can do his tajweed properly. He does not have lahan, or he is not unable to pronounce the words in the way that they should be pronounced in terms of Quranic recitation. Why? Because if he does not know the Quran properly, then his prayer will be deficient and even potentially invalid. And because such a person, when you have sort of rusty and bad recitation, then people are not very eager to follow you. And so it connects to both the principles that we mentioned previously. And the second condition is that such a person is not suspect in his religion and piety. And usually they say that he does not engage in al-fawahish, or sort of very evil deeds in a public manner. Again, the reason is because this undermines the idea of afdaliya and being akmal that Imam al-Kasani mentions, and also because people are very averse to following an individual who is not considered pious. And so again, it undermines both the principles that we mentioned. And this is mentioned by Imam Sarakhsi in Al-Mabsut. Then we have أقرأهم لكتاب الله تعالى, the most versed in the Quran. Now this can either refer to, the ulama have some khilaf on whether it refers to the memorization of the Quran, how much a person is memorized, or to tajweed and reciting in a very beautiful mode and manner. And it seems from many of the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, and his companions, that there was a strong element of who had the most Quran memorized. And so there are several hadith where a companion is put forward to lead the people in prayer because he was known to have memorized the most Quran. But for the companions, of course, tajweed was not an issue, right? They knew how to pronounce the words. And so on a tajweed plane, they were pretty much, I guess you can say, at least the people who were generally on an equal playing field. And then the consideration thus became more about memorization of the Quran. Now, most Hanafi seem to prefer the idea that no, most versed in the Quran refers to someone who can recite the Quran properly and beautifully and with proper tajweed, and this is also a valid interpretation. And then we have the person who is most scrupulous. In the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet said, فَأَقْدَمُهُمْ هِجْرَةً, that the people who emigrated first, but because لا هجرة بعد الفتح, that the Prophet ﷺ said there's no emigration after the Fath of Mecca, so emigration has sort of ceased to be. So the ulama replaced scrupulousness or wara' instead of hijrah to Medina. And wara' is actually a degree higher than taqwa, because the one who is scrupulous is someone, right? What does he do? He avoids the doubtful matters as well. They say often that the person of taqwa is someone who avoids the haram. The person of wara' is someone who avoids the doubtful. And the person of zuhud is one who avoids the mubah out of fear of falling into something disliked. And so being scrupulous is deemed to be a higher category than taqwa. And again, the most versed, the most scrupulous, here, once more, people are more eager to follow someone who is more pious. And the prayer of the pious, the individual who is pious, has an afdaliyah, has a superiority to him that other people do not. And so it returns to that same legal principle that we mentioned earlier. Then we have being elder. This is also explicit in the hadith, as we mentioned, in Sahih Muslim and various other sources. And again, the legal rationale for this particular rule is that the elder one has more worship. Generally, I mean, this was at least the norm in most societies, most Muslim societies, and people are also eager to follow someone who is more elderly than someone who is very young. Because the elderly, they command a degree of respect that someone who is young might not in the community. And so again, it connects to both the topic governing principles that we took on this issue. And so that's pretty straightforward. Then Imam al-Quduri continues by saying, وَيُكْرَهُ تَقْدِيمُ الْعَبْدِ وَالْأَعْرَابِ وَالْفَاسِقِ وَالْأَعْمَى الزِّنَا فَإِنْ تَقَدَّمُوا جَازَ. Putting forward a slave, a Bedouin, a Fasiq, someone who is blind, or a child of zina is disliked. If they are put forward, it is permitted. Now, this is a ruling that often gets people to ask questions regarding, well, why would it be disliked for individuals to put these types of people forward? For a Fasiq, it's pretty straightforward. Individuals understand why you wouldn't put someone to be forward to be an imam, but why does this ruling apply to a slave or a Bedouin or a blind person or a child of zina who had nothing to do with the sins of his parents? And what the ulama mention is that the reason why these categories of people were deemed disliked is because, one, either they lacked knowledge of legal rulings related to salah. So Bedouins, even though they were learned Bedouins and Bedouins who had a deep sense of iman, during the time of the Prophet ﷺ also, Bedouins were also known as people who did not have necessarily access to knowledge and people who were, they lacked the ilm of the Sharia in a way that would instill confidence to put them forward as the imam. A second reason people mention, that the ulama mention, is that these are people who are potentially unable to perform prayer soundly. So, for example, someone who is blind may not be able to detect filth that is on his person or on his clothing. He may not have done wudu properly, and so on and so forth, or tayammum, etc. And so that's why there's a dislikeness associated with that. And then people were not eager to follow some of these individuals. And this is simply a reality of societies, that we have specific social classes, and individuals are more eager to follow a specific type of person than others. And so there was something like the walad zina, someone who was born out of wedlock. People generally were averse to follow him. But the ulama are also clear, especially when it comes to all the categories except the fasiq, that there's nothing intrinsic in these people that makes the imamat disliked. Right? There's nothing intrinsic in these people. And if an Arabi or an Abd or a walad zina, if he is someone who is versed in the Qur'an, if he is someone who's versed in the fiqh, then there's no harm whatsoever in putting these people. And the Hanafi are actually quite clear whenever they talk about a child out of wedlock. They're quite clear and explicit in pointing out that he is not responsible for the sins of his father, and he should not be. We do not punish him for the sins of his father and his mother, but because the imam is supposed to serve this broader function of trying to ensure a greater congregation, that prayer is performed in the most excellent of ways. We have mentioned this rule while conditioning it with the fact that if these individuals know the Qur'an and know the Sunnah, that they are as fit as anyone else to lead the people in prayer. The Fasiq, of course, was the only exception to this rule, because even if the Fasiq knew the Sunnah, even if he was versed in the Qur'an, doing of him or putting him in a position of imam, there is a degree of almost honoring this fisq and flouting the religion. And so the person who is a fasiq is not given that position of honor, which is leadership of the Muslim community in their prayers. So this is something that we need to take into account. And again, these three reasons that the ulama mentioned for the karaha of some of these returns the governing principles that we mentioned, that because of potential lack of knowledge regarding the sunnah of salah and a potential inability to perform the prayer soundly, this will lead to a prayer that is deficient and which people are not eager to join. And so this sort of undermines the function of the Jama'ah as a place where believers come together in prayer and in worship, and it has a strong social and communal function that is undermined by putting forward certain people. Then Imam al-Quduri mentioned وَيَنْبَغِي لِلْإِمَامِ أَنْ لَا يُطَوِّلَ بِهِمُ الصَّلَاةِ. The Imam should not lengthen the prayer. And we've discussed this issue previously. Why should he not lengthen the prayer? Because it causes difficulty for people and it discourages them from coming to the Jama'ah. And this connects to the principle again that we mentioned. And some of the Hanafi Imams actually said that to lengthen the prayer in a way that causes difficulty for the congregation is actually considered makruh tahrimi, or prohibitively disliked, meaning the Imam would be sinful for doing this. And there's a lot of debate regarding whether this is mutlaq, whether this is an unconditional or whether it only applies to lengthening beyond the sunnah amount. There's debate in the Hanafi school regarding this. Many of the ulama said it only relates to lengthening beyond the amount deemed a sunnah, but the hadith of Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, where the Prophet ﷺ said, that you should recite in accordance with what the weakest from your to handle, and that will vary from one congregation to another. And so the basic rule is the Imam should not lengthen the prayer in a way where the weakest members of his congregation would be discouraged and would find it hard in the future to come to the congregation because of his lengthening of the prayer. Then Imam al-Quduri mentioned وَيُكْرَهُ لِلنِّسَاءِ أَن يُصَلِّينَ وَحْدَهُنَّ جَمَاعَةً فإن فعلا ذلك وقفت الإمام وسطهن. It is disliked for women to pray in a women-only congregation. If they do perform it, the female Imam stands in the middle of them. Now, the reason why there's a khilaf between us and the Shafi'is on this. The Shafi'is say that it is recommended based on the tradition that she asked the Prophet ﷺ to appoint a mu'adhin in her house, and the Prophet visited her house and sort of inaugurated it as a place where she could perform the congregation. And see that Aisha radiallahu anha is also known to have led women in congregation. And so the Shafi'is use this as their proof that the congregation of women, a women-only congregation, is considered mustahab. The reason for this is because, one, the Hanafi said that this was not something that was a normative practice of the Sahabiyat during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. And if it was, we would have had far more reports regarding the existence of this practice than the reports that we have currently. So that's the first reason they mentioned. The second reason they mentioned is that they say that it is not possible for a congregation, basically, a jama'ah has certain sunnah before, like the adhan and the iqama we mentioned were from the sunnah of salah. And there are other sunnah of salah, like reciting out loud or the way the imam is supposed to stand and so on and so forth, that the Hanafi say is not possible to perform in a female-only congregation because women are not supposed to be given the adhan or the iqama or recite out loudly because their prayer is based on what is most sealing or astur. And so they have this principle that if the sunnah of congregation is not possible to fulfill, then the congregational performance is no longer deemed recommended. And so they say that because these various sunan cannot be fulfilled in a female-only congregation, it indicates to us that their congregation is not considered recommended in itself. Argues that no, there are plenty of hadith to justify that female women-only congregation is considered recommended. and that the Sahabiyat did engage in it. And in a scholar would of course be um, intelligent enough to take note of the fact that sometimes specific rulings from other madhahib can be given when it becomes more conducive to the religious practice of individuals. And so female only congregations are, especially in our times today, where there's a general lack of religiosity either way, and where um, jama'ah is also a form of social bonding, and is a form of uh, and connecting with other believers. And female only congregations, in that sense, if our sisters do hold female only congregations, if they do have female only masajid, for example, or spaces where they perform their congregational prayers without men, then this is not something that people need to be sort of gung ho about. Rather, uh, uh, based on in our age, to say that it is recommended for women to attend these spaces because it is a way for them to cultivate their religiosity, and it is a way for them to connect to other believing women, and to come together in prayer and ibadah, and that Sunni Islam is vast when it comes to respecting difference of opinion. And so these are, we mentioned some of these legal rulings because behind them, but that does not mean that we have to go out and start giving fatwa on female only mosques being disliked, or female only prayers being disliked, or if our moms and khalas and aunts and whoever are praying in their homes together, to go tell them that what they're doing is disliked. There is a level of wisdom and foresight that's needed, and like I mentioned, given generally the state of religion and religiosity in our times, there are things that are far worse that people could be engaged in than gathering together in a space to perform prayers together. And so we should be aware and cognizant of that fact. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions, وَمَنْ صَلَّى مَا وَاحِدٍ أَقَامَهُ عَنْ يَمِينِهِ فَإِنْ كَانَ مَا اثْنَيْنِ تَقَدَّمَ عَلَيْهِمَا. Whoever prays with one other person, he makes him stand to his right. If with two people, he stands in front of them. And this is pretty straightforward. We all recognize this ruling. وَلَا يُجُوزُ لِلرِّجَالِ أَنْ يَقْتَدُوا بِامْرَأَةٍ أَوْ صَبِيٍّ فَإِنْ فَعَلُوا ذَلك بَطَلَتْ صَلَاتُهُمْ. It is not permitted for men or a child, and if they do this, their prayer is invalidated. And there's near ijma' on this point, but this is something that we can look in with slightly more detail. This returns to this topic governing principle that we took earlier, that every individual whom another can validly follow in a prayer that is built his tahrima upon, then that person is suitable to serve as an imam for him in that prayer. And so imam cannot validly follow, a child cannot be an imam for men. And one of the reasons when it comes to women is because the Prophet said, أخرهن. There's a hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he said that, sort of make them stand at the end of the rows. And this was a command, and a command entails wujub with the Hanafis. And so the Hanafis say that the sufuf and the order of the sufuf, when it comes to men being at the front and women being behind them, is an order that needs to be abided by and is wajib, right? It is necessary. Some even said a fard of salah. And so by allowing a woman to lead, you are going against this fard, which would... The broader point over here when it comes to this whole discussion of who one can follow in prayer and who one cannot is based on this idea that we took earlier. that following is building one prayer on the prayer of another person, right? You're building your tahrima on the tahrima of another person. You're building your prayer on the prayer of another person. And so when you attach your prayer to that of the imam, what effectively, the way the fuqaha conceptualize this, is that they say that the prayer of the imam begins, basically encloses and captures and contains the prayer of the follower, such that if the prayer of the imam becomes fasid or invalidated, the follower's prayer is invalidated. When the imam does an action, the follower has to follow that action, right? And of the prayer of the follower. And so what this means, this aspect of attaching one tahrima to another, what this requires is firstly a common participation in their respective prayers. So they need to be part of the same prayer. And what that means is that firstly, their tahrima needs to be the same. You cannot, for example, the imam cannot 5 minutes before him, right? Because you're no longer participating in the same prayer, because the same prayer requires the same tahrima. The imam's tahrima followed by your tahrima with the intention of joining the imam's prayer. And then there needs to be also a correspondence in their prayers, an ittihad between the prayers. So you cannot be praying the dhuhr of yesterday and he's praying, the imam is praying the dhuhr of dhuhr and the imam is praying asr. So there needs to be an ittihad when it comes to, or a correspondence when it comes to the prayers. These are two very basic conditions entailed by this idea that iqtida, or following, is building one tahrima on the tahrima of another. There are various other shurut like musharaka fil arkan, fil shurut, etc., etc., that also need to be fulfilled, which we'll take in detail. But for now, what you need to understand is, because following is building one prayer on the other, because it is an individual or a follower attaching or anchoring his prayer to the prayer of the imam, the only way this can be achieved, or what this entails, is you need to be participating in the same prayer, and there needs to be a correspondence in your prayer as well. And so we'll take how these how both of these manifest. Not deemed as eligible as an imam for men. She does not have the ahliyah to be an imam for men, because it was not the normative practice of Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ gave a command that women should be in a particular position when it comes to the congregational prayer, and this sort of undermines that command. And this is why a man cannot build his tahrima on her tahrim, woman. As for a male child, then the child, all of his prayers are effectively deemed nafil. They are deemed supererogatory prayers, right? Because the male child, and specifically what we mean here is the male child who has not hit puberty, right? Because someone who's hit puberty is considered, legally speaking, an adult, right? The age of adulthood. So a child, all of his prayers are deemed supererogatory. Why? Because he's not mukallaf to begin with. He's not morally responsible to begin with. There is no fard upon him before the age of puberty. So any prayer that he engages in counts as a supererogatory prayer. And it is not valid to build a fard prayer, an obligatory prayer, on a nafil prayer. Why? Because there's an absence, of course, ittihad between both the prayers. And oftentimes the ulama explain this in various ways. So they have these legal rationales where they say that if the imam is praying nafil and the follower is praying a fard prayer, then you are basically building something stronger on something weaker. The fard prayer is stronger than the nafil prayer, stronger on something that is weak. Okay, that's one of the rationales they mention. Another rationale they mention is that it is building on the non-existent. And what they mean by this is that the attribute of obligatoriness or the sifa of fardiyya is non-existent in respect to the prayer of the imam. The child is praying, the attribute of obligatoriness is not existent. And so any follower who is intending an obligatory prayer cannot follow the imam, right? Because the intention that he's intending for the prayer is basically non-existent in the prayer of the imam. And one of the things that Imam al-Marghini mentions is that of the salah of the muqtadi, when we talk about the imam as someone whose prayer encompasses the prayer of the follower and guarantees the prayer of the follower, the nafal can never encompass the fard, because the fard is of a higher status. Because the fard is of a higher status, and so the nafal can never encompass the fard. And so in this case, because are deemed nawafil, whether he's leading you in quote-unquote dhuhr, even if he does the intention of dhuhr, his 4 rak'ahs of dhuhr count as a supererogatory prayer in his right, in the right of the child. And so no one who's an adult behind him who's praying an actual fard prayer can validly follow him because of the various reasons that we've mentioned. As for the pray behind a child who is, can an adult pray a nafal behind a child? The scholars of Balkh said it's valid. The scholars of Bukhara said it is not valid. And the scholars of Bukhara, the reason why they said it's not valid is because they said that even the supererogatory prayer of a child is of a lower status and lower degree, of a lower strength than the nawafil of a adult. And some of the ahkam that they bring to justify this is that they say that, well, if an adult starts a nafil prayer and he breaks it, he has to do qada of it. If a child starts a supererogatory prayer and breaks it, he does not have to do qada of it. Why? Because the child aslan he's not mukallaf. There's no taklif associated with him. And so even his nafil prayer, its strength is weaker than the normal nafil prayer of someone who is an adult. You go back to the same reasoning again, that you cannot build something strong. You cannot build something stronger on the weaker, or the weaker cannot encompass something that is and guarantee something that is stronger than it. And there's no ittihad or a correspondence when it comes to these two prayers. Then Imam al-Quduri continues by saying, وَيَصُفُّ الرِّجَالُ, then men stand in the front, then children, then hermaphrodites, and then women. Again, this is something that is not very complicated, and so we'll just continue. فإن قامت امرأة إلى جنب رجل وهما مشتركان في صلاة واحدة فسدت صلاتها لا صلاتها. If a woman stands next to a man and they are in the same prayer, his prayer is invalidated, but not hers. This is a and it'll just take us on a lengthy ride, and inshallah in future courses we'll try to detail this issue more. But this is something that is contrary to qiyas. It is contrary to analogy. Analogy dictates that a woman standing next to a man in prayer should not invalidate it. Like there's no reason why that counts as an invalidator of prayer. That this ruling is established by way of istihsan. And istihsan is essentially the general idea behind istihsan is that you are going against or you are discarding what is the obvious analogical conclusion for a less obvious conclusion because of various considerations that have come to the mind of the faqih. And so in this particular case, the Hanafis essentially argued from the perspective of the hadith that we mentioned before regarding a female being an imam to men, which is akhiruhunna, that they should stand, that the Prophet commanded this, and the command entails wujub or fardiyah, that she should stand behind the man in prayer. And so by going against the wujub, or going against the obligation over here, what you are doing is you are corrupting your prayer. And so this was the essential, basic legal reasoning that the Hanafis mentioned. And then the basis when it comes to istihsan is the Hanafis are very restrictive when it came to istihsan. So a ruling that is established by way of istihsan will have conditions attached to it that are very stringent, and that cannot be extended further, and that are in keeping with how the exception has been related in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. So an example of this that we've taken in previous lessons is, does laughing out loud break your wudu if you do it in prayer? And the Hanafi said yes. If you laugh out loud in prayer, your wudu is broken. But the hadith regarding laughing out loud breaking your prayer only came regarding prayer in which you had an actual sajda and a ruku', a proper full prayer. And so the Hanafi said that because this is an istihsani ruling, we are only going to apply this ruling for what the hadith has said. For the context of the hadith. And so if you laugh out loud, it's not nullified. Why? Because Salatul Janazah it's not a full prayer. It does not have ruku', it does not have sujood. And the hadith regarding the breaking of your wudu by laughing in prayer was specifically about a prayer in which there was ruku' and sujood. And so the Hanafis were very restrictive when it came to istihsan by way of when it came to when this muhada, when this standing of a woman next to a man would invalidate the prayer. And amongst those conditions where she has to be an adult, she has to be in the same prayer as the man, they have to be behind the imam with the same tahrima, and various other conditions that we'll detail in future lessons. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions وَيُكْرَهُ لِلنِّسَاءِ حُضُورُ الْجَمَاعَاتِ وَلَا بَأْسَ بِأَنْ تَخْرُجَ الْعَجُوزُ فِي الْفَجْرِ وَالْمَغْرِبِ وَالْعِشَاءِ عند أبي حنيفة وقال يجوز خروج العجوز في الصلوات كلها. It is disliked for women to attend the congregational prayer. There is no harm in an elderly woman attending Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, according to Abu Hanifa. This is an issue that's had a lot of discussion. And the Hanafi said that the basis is that a woman's prayer in her home is preferable. Right? The basis is that a woman's prayer in her home is preferable. And the ulama use this hadith from Abu Dawood, لا تمنعوا نساءكم المساجد وبيوتهن خير لهن. Do not prevent your women folk from the masajid and their others. And so this becomes the basis for this idea that it is preferable for women to pray in their homes, right? Because again, it returns to the topic governing principle we took 2 or 3 lessons ago, that the salah of a woman is built on what is astur, or what is more concealing, and prayer at the home is more concealing. And so this was deemed odd. One of the questions that arises is, well, but this hadith does not actually prohibit women or prevent women from coming to the masjid. It actually does the opposite. It's telling you that you should not prevent women from coming to the mosques. So why are these fuqaha preventing women from coming to the mosques? And so over here, what you have is the following discussion. Last one hadith that's on your left over here. Now this hadith is unconditional. It allows women to attend the mosque. It does not say it's makruh. It does not say it's haram. It's a command. It's telling men, don't prevent women from coming to the masajid. And it is established that during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, women would come to the masajid. And so that's one hadith. But then what the Hanafis did, what some of the Hanafis did was, actually, and many of the ulama from other madhahib as well, is that they say that, well, we have other hadith from the Prophet ﷺ, like this one that is highlighted in red on the right, أيما امرأة أصابت بخورا فلا تشهد معنا الإشاء, that any female who basically applies a fragrance, then she should not attend the Isha with us. And so over here, the Prophet is conditioning the attendance of females when it comes to the masajid with there being a lack of fitna or something that would be conducive to an environment of fitna. And so what the Hanafis say is that this particular hadith, that this unconditional hadith actually has come with a condition, which is that that women can come to the mosques so long as there is so long as they come in a way where fitna is not induced. And this takhsis, or this specification of this original hadith of not preventing women from coming to the masajid, the Hanafi ulama mentioned that it is also, its specification is also justified by many other hadith, general hadith about the avoidance of fitna and so on and so forth. And then we have the statement of Sayyidah Aisha radiallahu anha, that if the Prophet ﷺ had seen what the women in our times are doing, he would have prevented them from mosques. And the actions of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, where he did, in fact, at least temporarily, stop women from coming to the mosques because of various reasons. And so the Hanafi see all of this justifies this idea of it being disliked for women to come to the mosques. They slowly expanded these by looking at their by looking at their particular context and times, right? Sorry, just 1 second. So what the Hanafis did was, expand this sort of prohibition because of changing times and changing context. And so they identified an asl, which was that, well, in some contexts, it is possible to prevent women from coming to the mosques. Then they said that this prohibition or this prevention basically centers on and then they said that, well, in our times, this fitna and this fasad have become even more enhanced, right, and become even more widespread. And so this is why we are permitted to expand this legal ruling. Sorry, just 1 second. Just 1 second. What? So where were we? So the conditions of the time and fatwa. So essentially, what the Hanafi ulama did was they saw this this basis when it came to a lack of fitna and its condition on a lack of harm and other such considerations. And so then they expanded this legal ruling in their own time. And so eventually the Hanafis reached a point where it was effectively women cannot come to the mosques, right? And they understood, they recognized, like Ibn Humam recognized, he said that we recognize that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ over here, ayyuma imra'atin asabat bukhuran, this is not a reference to all women. Like, we recognize this point that it is not a reference to all women. So the question can be raised, why are we preventing all women from coming to the mosque? And Ibn al-Humam and others, the way they respond is they don't put the burden on the female herself. What they say is things like لأن الفساق في زماننا كثر انتشارهم بالليل, because the fusaq, because they are corrupt men who sort of hang out at night, and their presence has increased in our times. لغلبة الفساد في سائر الأوقات, because of the preponderance of basically corruption and corrupt activity at all times. And so this is why they made the prohibition more general. And so one of the interesting things over here to note, of course, is the reason why we're discussing these legal reasonings, and the reason why we're mentioning how these things were thought about by the fuqaha is the fuqaha are premising their rulings on particular factors. They're premising their rulings on, they're acknowledging, yes, the Prophet did not prohibit women from coming to mosques. The Prophet did condition attendance by specific things, but these things also apply to men. The Prophet said things about men coming to the mosques who eat onions, or who have strong stench coming from their mouth, and so on and so forth. But we need to understand the thought process of the fuqaha, which was they found a factor or a condition, and they took it to its what they saw as its logical and ethical conclusion, which was that in their times this is what the ruling should be, because we want to preserve women from being exposed to this environment of fitna, and from this environment in which people who are fasiqun, people who are corrupt, are sort of roaming around in the streets at night, and so on and so forth. And so what modern day fuqaha, a lot of what they do is they take into account similar considerations. They look at these rulings and they say, well, what the fuqaha are doing in this case are they're taking these social factors into account of fasad and fitna and so on and so forth, and they're premising a ruling on it, right? And they're justifying the extension of the original ruling, because Abu Hanifa and others, they're still allowing specific categories of women to come to the mosque, right? ولا بأس بأن تخرج العجوز في الفجر والمغرب والعشاء عند أبو حنيفة وقال يجوز خروج العجوز في الصلوات كلها. There's no harm in an elderly woman attending Fajr, Maghrib, and Isha, according to Abu Hanifa. And the two companions said it is permitted for them for all prayers. Later, Hanafi ulama say no, it's all these prayers are prohibited for everyone. And so they're changing the ruling. And so if you can change the ruling in one direction, then technically you should be able to contemplate the ability to change it in the opposite direction as well, based on a different set of social considerations, such as, well, how does this impact, again, the religiosity, the religious connectiveness, the sense of belonging to community, the access to knowledge, etc., of women in our community. Right? And so this is how fuqaha think, because over here we need to understand what the legal reasoning is underpinned by. What is it underpinned by? What is it grounded in? And does that legal reasoning allow a scope for saying, well, fi zamanihim hakadha, in their time it was like this, fi zamanina it should be like this, right? And in our times it should be like this. And so this is where this legal reasoning comes into play, because if you just say, well, Abu Hanifa said this, and that's the end of it, and we need to bind ourselves to that for all of eternity, then this is not really how fiqh works. Fiqh works by understanding the legal reasoning and the legal meanings that are underpinning these legal rulings, why the fuqaha were thinking the way they were, why they were ruling the way they were, and then to see whether these ilal, whether these legal reasons, these legal causes, whether these legal meanings uh, lend themselves or should lend themselves to the same conclusions today as they would have, 100, 150, 200, 500 years ago. And so over here, we find that the ulama were more than willing to expand the legal ruling because they premised it on a consideration of time, a place, a particular conception of avoiding fitna and fasad, both protecting the hurma of the masjid and protecting the hurma of women as people who do not deserve to be, harassed or looked at or harangued on the streets by people who are fasaq. And so they had these ethical considerations that they took, and then we can have considerations that we look at when it comes to opening up spaces in our masajid for women in a way that minimizes fitna and fasad, but also recognizes that these spaces are needed in order to have an environment in which women can thrive religiously and have a real attachment to the broader community. Then Imam al-Quduri mentions ولا يصلي الطاهر خلف من به سلس البول ولا الطاهرات خلف المستحاضة ولا القارئ خلف الأمي ولا المكتسي خلف الأريان. So the one who is in a state of purity does not pray behind someone who suffers from urinary incontinence, nor does the female who is pure pray behind a woman with irregular bleeding, nor does the one able to recite pray behind someone who is mute, nor does the one who is clothed pray behind someone who is naked. So over here, in the first two scenarios, Salasul Bawl and the Mustahada, these are basically referred to as people who have an udhr, Sahib al-Udhr, and we took this in the sections on Tahara, what a Sahib al-Udhr is. The Sahib al-Udhr is basically someone who there's a nullifier of he's not free of a nullifier of ablution, right? So Salas al-Bawl is, there's constant urinary incontinence. Urine is constantly dripping. The Mustahada, there's at least assumed a constant presence of blood. So these are individuals who are characterized by the presence of a nullifier of wudu, which they are not free of for the duration of a whole prayer time, and then subsequently for the duration for at least once during every prayer time. And we've taken the details regarding this, and so these people become Sahib al-Udhr, which means that najasa that they're suffering from, right, that nullifier of wudu that they're suffering from, is considered excused in their right, and so they can do wudu and pray even with the existence of that nullifier. And there are specific conditions regarding when you become Sahib al-Udhr and when you do not, and that we took in the sections on Tahara. Over here, why can these two individuals not be the imam for someone who is in a normal state of purity? Imam al-Kasani mentions that this is because the tahrima of the imam was not entered into for a prayer in which an excuse was not present. So the Sahib al-Udhr, when he does tahrima, when he says Allahu Akbar, he does not enter into a prayer in which an excuse was not present. He enters into a prayer with the intent that I am praying with this najasa, or I am praying with this excuse. And so building on it, Imam al-Kasani says, is not permitted for someone who does not have an excuse. Because the tahrima, the imam's tahrima is meant to encompass the tahrima of the follower. The imam has done a tahrima, and he has entered into the tahrima for a prayer for which an excuse is present. The follower is following him in his tahrima, but he is entering into a prayer. He's entering into it with the intent of a prayer without an excuse, right? And this leads into Imam al-Malghinani's point, which is the person who is sound is stronger in his state than the one who has an excuse. And a thing does not contain or include that which is above it, right? A thing does not contain or include that which is above it. And so an excuse is lower in its, a person who has an excuse, his state of tahara is lower, you can say, or his general state is lower than the person who is in a normal state of purity. The sahib al-udhr is lower than the one in a normal state of purity, and so his prayer cannot encompass the prayer of the follower who's in a normal state of purity. Imam al-Ghinani, Imam al-Kasani are basically essentially saying similar things. Imam al-Kasani is saying because the tahrima of the Imam was entered into in a specific way, and the followers' tahrima does not match up with this or cannot be included in this, that is why he cannot follow this Imam. And Imam al-Ghinani is saying the same thing. So again, we have this idea of building the stronger on the weaker, or building the weaker on the stronger, based on the notion that the weak cannot encompass the strong, but the strong can encompass and include and be a guarantor for something weaker. And then the last two cases are very similar in terms of the legal reasoning. وَلِلْقَارِئِ خَلْفَ الْأُمِّي وَلِلْمُقْتَسِي خَلْفَ الْأُرْيَانِ. And I'll leave it to the listeners to try and figure out how they would phrase the legal principles regarding this issue. Then Imam al-Quduri says, وَيُجُوزُ أَنْ يَؤُمَّ الْمُتَيَمِّمُ الْمُتَوَضِّئِينَ وَالْمَاسِحُ الْخُفَّيْنِ الْغَاسِلِينَ وَيُصَلِّي الْقَائِمُ خَلْفَ الْقَائِدِ. That it is permitted for the person to perform tayammum to lead one who has performed wudu, and the one who wiped over his khufs to lead one who washed his feet. The one standing may pray behind the one sitting. Now over here, for tayammum and wiping over khufs, this is because tayammum and wiping over khufs are considered complete replacements for ablution and washing the feet respectively. Right? They are considered complete replacements. They are not considered of a lower degree. Right? Wiping over your khufs is treated as if you washed your feet. It is treated as if you washed your feet. This is why for wiping over the khufs, you don't even need an udhr, you don't even need an excuse, which is why you can do it while you're resident. You just put your footwear on and you wipe over them. So it is treated as a complete replacement for washing the feet. Tayammum is also, even though tayammum is rests on the existence of an excuse, tayammum is also deemed by the Hanafis to be a complete replacement for ablution. And this is why, and one of the ways this manifests is that if you look at Imam Shafi'i? Sorry, I can't remember, but if you look at the Hanafis at least, the Hanafis say, and a state of purity attained by tayammum allows you to perform the exact same things that you would have been allowed to perform in a state of normal wudu. You can touch the mushaf, you can recite, you can perform as many prayers as you want, etc., etc. You know, and so they say this is an indication that tayammum is a complete replacement for the ablution, even though it is only permitted in the absence of water, either effectively or actually. So both of these things were treated as complete replacements for ablution and washing the feet respectively. And so the imam who's performing salah in a state of tayammum, right, is at least equal to the individual who's performing salah in a state of wudu, because tayammum is a complete purificatory act, and because ablution is a complete purificatory act, and because tayammum is a complete replacement for ablution, there is no non-correspondence over here, right? There is no idea of the state of purity from the tayammum being weaker than the state of purity from wudu, according to the Hanafi ulama, at least Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf, because Imam Muhammad actually deferred on this issue of tayammum. And then we have a principle that the replacement of something stand in its place. Badalu shay'i yaqumu maqamahu. Right? As for standing behind the one praying, then it is valid by way of istihsan. The basis when it comes to this is again the idea that someone who is not performing one of the arkan of salah, which is standing, his prayer is weaker, or his state is weaker than the one who's praying standing behind him, because the follower in this case is performing salah with all of its arkan. The imam is performing a salah with one of the arkan missing, which is standing. But the Hanafis over here say that this is allowed by way of istihsan, because the Prophet ﷺ led his companions in a state of sitting during his final illness, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imam Muhammad, as we mentioned, has some khilaf on tayammum and on this particular issue as well. And Imam Muhammad deems the person praying in tayammum, the person who's leading, if he's in a state of tayammum, then he cannot be followed by someone who's in a state of normal purity. And similarly, the person who is leading while sitting down with bowing and prostration cannot lead someone who is standing, for various reasons, which we won't get into, because the position of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf is considered the relied upon position of the school. Then he says, ولا يصلي الذي يركع ويسجد خلف المومي ولا يصلي المفترض خلف المتنفل ولا من يصلي فرضا خلف من يصلي فرضا آخر ويصلي المتنفل خلف المفترض. The one who can bow and prostrate does not pray behind someone who performs head movements. Again, because of the reasoning that we took earlier, the one performing an obligatory prayer does not pray behind someone performing a supererogatory prayer. We also explained this. Nor does he pray behind someone performing a different obligatory prayer. Why? Because there's no ittihad du salatain. There's no correspondence in terms of their prayers, and their tahrima has effectively been enacted for two different prayers, right? For two different prayers, and because one fard prayer cannot encompass another fard prayer, they are of an equal strength, if not, or at least a completely different one. One fard prayer cannot encompass a completely different fard prayer, because the tahrima of one does not apply to the other. They become two distinct prayers. And then the one performing a supererogatory prayer can pray behind someone performing an obligatory prayer. And this is because the obligatory prayer is considered stronger than the nafl prayer, and so the tahrima of the obligatory prayer can encompass the supererogatory prayer in this case. And there are, again, what we took in this particular section is we took various ways in which you can express this legal ruling. Right? You can express it as building a tahrima on the tahrima of another, which requires participation in the same prayer and correspondence in the same prayer. That was one way of explaining it. Another way of explaining it was building the stronger on the weaker, or the weaker on the stronger. Another way of explaining it was saying that the imam's prayer does not encompass or include the prayer of the follower, and vice versa. All of these things are effectively they're coming back to a similar core meaning or core idea. And so if you look at these ahkam, you should be able to now determine why is it that the Hanafis are allowing some of these prayers or some of these congregational settings, but not allowing others. And so we won't get into all the details regarding this and spelling it out. Hopefully the students will be able to figure it out based on what we've mentioned in terms of the principles. And then Imam al-Quduri says, وَمَنْ اقْتَدَى بِإِمَامٍ ثُمَّ عَلِمَ أَنَّهُ عَلَى غَيْرِ طَهَارَةٍ عَادَ الصَّلَاةِ. If one followed the Imam and then came to know that he was not in a state of purity, he repeats his prayer. And again, this returns to the principle that we took, that the Imam's prayer effectively encompasses or includes the prayer of the follower. And by anchoring your tahrima to the tahrima of the Imam, you're also anchoring the validity and soundness of your prayer to the prayer of the Imam. So if the Imam was not in a state of purity, then your prayer was not considered valid, right? And that's pretty straightforward. We're going to quickly take this dislike section. I'll probably spend like 15 minutes on it, because it's fairly straightforward, and I think we're lagging behind a little bit in our timing over here. But the book of prayer, the disliked actions. So we've taken the congregational prayer, Hopefully that's clear to everyone. This is a chart we took in, I believe, our second lesson in Kitab al-Tahara. We took this grading of legal rulings: obligatory, wajib, confirmed sunnah, and non-confirmed sunnah. We defined what is the obligatory and the wajib: actions whose performance takes precedence over its non-performance, while the latter, that is the non-performance, is prohibited. This non-performance can be prohibited by way of either decisive evidence, in which case it is obligatory to perform the act, or this non-performance can be prohibited by way of probabilistic evidence or dhanni evidence, in which case it is wajib. And so the difference between obligatory and wajib is the difference between the nature of the evidence in terms of its epistemological strength. And we've spoken about Hanafi epistemology quite often in this class. Then we have the confirmed sunnah and the non-confirmed sunnah. Again, actions whose performance takes precedence over its non-performance, while the latter, the non-performance, is not prohibited. The non-performance is not prohibited. If this action, if it was performed diligently without leave, and if it is from the symbols / perfecting of the religion, then it is considered a sunnah mu'akkada. Okay? And a non-confirmed sunnah is if this action was performed occasionally and left occasionally. Then it becomes something that's mustahab or recommended. We took this in detail in previous lessons. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning this is because we want to mirror the haram and the disliked on this same pattern. So let's do that. So now we have over here actions whose non-performance takes precedence over its performance, while the performance of the action is prohibited. If it is prohibited by way of decisive evidence, it is haram. If it is prohibited by way of probabilistic evidence, it is makruh tahrimi or prohibitively disliked. So these are the exact opposites of the obligatory and the necessary. The opposite of the fard is the haram. The opposite of the wajib is considered makruh tahrimi or prohibitively disliked. And again, there is the reason why we have the distinction between the haram and the makruh tahrimi is because there's an epistemological point over here where the nature of the evidence is slightly different in terms of its strength. One is established by way of decisive evidence, the other by way of probabilistic evidence in terms of the prohibition that it establishes. Then we have actions whose non-performance takes precedence over its performance, while the latter is not prohibited. So the performance is not prohibited, right? But the non-performance takes precedence over the performance. Over here, if a text only indicates that leaving the action is better, then the ruling will be either it is makruh tanzihi, slightly disliked, or it is suboptimal or contrary to what is best, which is khilaf al-awla. Okay? And so these roughly match with the confirmed and the non-confirmed sunnah. Again, the reason why I have to stress this once more, that these are not, we can divide them into neat categories, but oftentimes, like we said, a single category runs on a spectrum. A single category runs on a spectrum. The confirmed sunnah can go right up to the tip of the wajib, or it can go right above the non-confirmed sunnah. So these rulings work on a spectrum. These general categories are just to facilitate our understanding regarding the types of legal rulings that we are working with. And so, this should hopefully be clear to everyone. So we're going to read this section quickly because it revolves around two fundamental interrelated points. One is the basis of the prayer. Is the slide okay? Can everyone see the slides properly? Okay, it looks fine on my end. Okay, we'll just continue, inshallah. If they do go blurry, just let me know again. So this is a section we'll read quickly. It revolves around two basic ideas. One is the basis of prayer is reverence and humility and calm. And so what this means is there are three main legal rulings that, or three main ideas that underpin this chapter. One is slight movements without need is slightly disliked, makruh tanzihi. Slight movements that are done repeatedly without need is prohibitively disliked, or makruh tahrimi. And then excessive movement invalidates the prayer. And excessive movement, there are at least 5 or 6 definitions of it in Hanafi texts. The most famous is that excessive movement is movement that if an onlooker were to see you, he would believe that you are not praying. Right? He would think that you are not in a prayer. That is excessive movement, and that invalidates the prayer. And then this section also revolves around the fact that prayer should be in accordance with what has come in the Sunnah of the Prophet. And of course, there's a relationship between these two, because what has come in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is an instruction for us in regards to how we perform our prayer with complete and proper reverence and humility. That is why the Prophet ﷺ, he taught us his prayer represents the peak of what it means to pray in a state of reverence and humility. So these are the two basic legal meanings that underpin this section. And so we'll go through the section quickly. وَيُكْرَهُ لِلْمُصَلِّ أَنْ يَعْبَثَ بِثَوْبِهِ أو بجسده ولا يقلب الحصاء إلا ألا يمكنه السجود عليه فيسويها مرة واحدة. It is disliked for the person praying to fidget with their clothing or any part of their body. There's actually a hadith on this as well. One does not turn over pebbles unless unable to prostrate, in which case he may move them away with one action. Because again, moving away pebbles is deemed to be slight movement, which is disliked. And the reason why they say do one action is because they say moving pebbles over here is a case of need, and a need is an action that is allowed by way of need is restricted to that amount that is required to fulfill that need. Okay, so just one swiping them away, you don't have to like smack them away, but just gently move them away with a single hand motion should be sufficient in this regard. And so Abath over here, when he says fidgeting is basically any action that is done without any reason, for an unsound reason, or without a need. And there's a general principle that Imam that the Sahib al-Nihaya mentions, which is that any action that is beneficial for the one praying, there's no harm in it. And one of the examples the fuqaha mention is, wiping sweat off of your brow. If you're like, it's hot outside, you're in a desert, you're sweating profusely, you can wipe sweat off of your brow, because there is a maslaha, there is a benefit in this for the musalli. If it's really hot and your clothes are sticking to your skin, the fuqaha say that it is permitted for you to, you can move your shirt a little bit, to move your shirt away from your skin, because they say there's a maslaha in this for the one praying. But fidgeting without need is considered disliked, and if it's done repeatedly, then prohibitively disliked. ولا يفرقع أصابعه ولا يتخسر ولا يصدل ثوبه. One does not crack his fingers, one does not place his hands on his flanks, because that is a sign of kibr and undermines the reverence that you're required to observe in prayer. Similarly with cracking the fingers. And one does not engage in sadal. This does not refer to the Maliki sadal of putting your hands on their sides. Sadal is basically defined as, generally, the easiest definition is that it is hanging a garment without wearing it in a customary manner. And so the ulama mentioned it's like placing something on your head, whose sides sort of flow down the sides of your body, or to put it on your shoulders. And so you do not wear it in a customary manner. It's like taking a coat and putting it on your shoulders, but not putting your hands in the sleeves of the coat. It's just hanging there on your shoulders. This would be sadal, and this is disliked, and the Prophet ﷺ disliked it because the ulama give various reasons. This one about it leading to fidgeting seems to be most sensible. Others said there's a form of tashabbuh with people of other religions. Imam al-Qarqi has another explanation which we don't need to get into. But we can see how it can also lead to fidgeting, because you're constantly trying to fix the placement of your garment. Whereas a coat, your hands are in it. Your hands are, when they're in the sleeves, then they're in the sleeves, and it's not an issue for you. Then he says, وَلَا يُشَبِّكُ أَصَابِعَهُ وَلَا يَعْقِسُ شِعْرَهُ وَلَا يَكُفُّ ثَوْبَهُ وَلَا يَلْتَفِتُ يَمِينًا وَشِمَالًا. One does not interlace his fingers, because this is again contrary to the sunnah of where you place your hands. One does not tie up his hair or gather his clothes. This tying up hair is really interesting. I still haven't understood it fully, why this is disliked, except that we do have an explicit prophetic hadith that was related by Bukhari, Muslim, and others, where he said that I was commanded to prostrate on 7 limbs and not to tie my hair or gather my clothes in prayer. So it's a really, it's an emphatic hadith, which is why the ulama mention it. Rather, the sunnah when it comes to hair is you just basically just leave it flowing without tying it in prayer. And gathering clothes refers to, some people, they might wear really, they have like baggy thobes, I guess. And when they go into sujood, they sort of gather their clothes together to go into sajda. And of course, this is considered, again, a form of movement and fidgeting, and so it is disliked, in addition to the explicit prophetic command. And one does not turn left and right. The dislikeness of turning left and right, it will basically depend on the manner in which it is done. If you're looking just with your eyes, then it is slightly disliked, because again, it shows that you are distracted and there's a lack of khushu' and reverence in your prayer. If it's by turning the face and the neck, then it is more severely disliked. And if it is by turning the entire body, then it can potentially invalidate your prayer if you turn away from the qibla. And we'll take the details of that in a future lesson. Then he says, وَلَا يَلْتَفِتُ يَمِينًا وَشِمَالًا, we took that. وَلَا يُقْعِي إِقْعَاءَ الْقَلْبِ وَلَا يَفْتَرِشُ ذِرَاعِيهِ. One does not squat like the squatting of a dog, and one does not spread his forearms on the ground during prostration. Squatting like a dog, there are 2 definitions provided by the ulama. Imam al-Tahawi mentions that it is basically you place your posterior on the ground along with the hands are on the ground as well, and you raise your knees in front such that they're basically against your chest. Why someone would sit like that in the prayer is I don't understand. But the Prophet ﷺ did tell his companions not to sit in this way during prayer, because once again, it shows it's not in keeping with the sunnah, and therefore it is not the optimal position that the Prophet ﷺ prescribed for the prayer and for showing God humility and reverence. Others described it differently, and you can read the slide. But the reason why it is disliked is similar, because it involves leaving the sunnah. Then he says, وَلَا يُرُدُّ الصَّلَامِ بِلِسَانِهِ وَلَا بِيَدِهِ وَلَا يَتَرَبَّعُ إِلَّا مِنْ عُذْرٍ. One does not respond to the salam with his tongue or his hand, and one does not sit cross-legged unless there is an excuse. Sitting cross-legged again is khilaf sunnah, because this was not the way the Prophet ﷺ sat in his prayers. And as for responding to the salam with his tongue or hand, we know there are certain hadith from the Prophet ﷺ where he did respond with his hands, and the Hanafis interpret that to mean that these were cases of real need. There's an individual who's leaving, who the Prophet would never see again, and the like. But the basis, again, you do not respond to people with your salam. Responding to them with the salam with the tongue would, of course, invalidate the prayer, as we'll take in the future. As for the hand, it will be disliked, because, again, it demonstrates, for the most part, a lack of reverence in the prayer. And the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that show him engaging in it are understood by Hanafis to be in very specific context, and not actions that justify this as a normal practice that is not disliked in the prayer. And then finally, the last slide, ولا يأكل ولا يشرب. One does not eat or drink. يشرب. And of course, this would invalidate the prayer, which is, I don't think anyone needs to be told. I think no one needs to be told that eating and drinking should not be done in the prayer. And so, inshallah, that is the end of our lesson. We took a lot in this lesson, a lot of, I guess, some topics that are important for Muslims, and things that they have heard about or have discussed, such as the prayer of women in congregation or women attending the mosques. Hopefully that was clarified to some extent. And then generally just keeping in mind the place of the congregational prayer in our religion, and the fact that it was a highly emphasized sunnah at the level of being a wajib, and some of the ulama even said it was fard. There are a few hadith that you'll find where the Prophet ﷺ expressed his desire to burn down structures because people were not performing prayer in congregation and not coming to the mosque for congregation. And so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq in performing our prayer in congregation and performing prayer in the masajid. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our masajid soon and safeguard us from this virus that we have all been affected with. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us ilm and grant us amal and grant us well-being and grant us shifa, and to protect us and protect all people everywhere, and to guide us. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Let me just see if there's any questions. Isn't there a difference between female-only congregation and female-only masajid? Yeah, there is. Female-only masajid is basically just a shorthand for me to refer to female-only congregation. Female-only masajid are fine. And I mentioned that the rule is there, the Hanafi rule is there. We can understand it. We know what the legal reasoning is. As students, we go through the books. We go through our books. We mention what the legal reasoning of our ulama was, how they thought, and then when it comes to actual fatwa and the guidance we give to people, then that's a different story. We keep in mind what the fuqaha said. We keep in mind the reasoning, but at the end of the day, we need to look at we have responsibility to see our own context and our own communities, and to see what's most conducive to their faith and most conducive to their practice of the religion. And so when it comes to female-only congregation, generally when it comes to these issues, many of the issues is, if there's a valid khilaf on it, then ahlan wa sahlan. There shouldn't be an issue. It shouldn't be a major issue if there is a valid khilaf on it. A whole madhab, the Shafi'i madhab says mustahab. If that's not going to sort of soften your attitude towards female-only congregations, then that's an issue, especially in a time, like I said, where religious practice is waning and where people they look for meaning in these things. Islam is a very social religion, whether it's Jum'ah, whether it's the central role of the masjid. Many of our ibadat have a very social component to them, and so we recognize that social connection that these rituals bring is an important part of instilling and cultivating religiosity within people, and so we need to keep that into account. And we said and be more broader and circumspect in our thinking on these issues. Let's see. And the same thing, of course, applies to females coming to the masajid. Females coming to the masajid, you simply have to look at what the reasoning of the fuqaha was. The fuqaha, the Hanafi fuqaha, And many other fuqaha, Hanafis are not the only ones to give this ruling. All the mainstream schools have similar rulings on this issue. But, the Hanafi fuqaha, at least, they acknowledge that, yes, the Prophet ﷺ did allow women to come to the masajid. Uh, we are giving this ruling based on X, Y, and Z consideration. A core consideration from amongst these considerations is our judgment regarding the particular time and place that we are in, and the spread of fasad and fitna, and so on and so forth. And so we are going to be expanding this ruling beyond its original scope. And so, jurists today should be thinking the same way. What is the legal ruling that I should be giving, taking into account these broad social factors and other factors, taking into account the needs of our community, taking into account the state of our community, taking into account the connection of our community to Islam and to faith, taking into account the religious practice, taking into account the function and role of the masajid today, taking into account the fact that we are in a non-Muslim country, taking into account X, Y, and Z, taking into account the original ruling of the Prophet ﷺ regarding women, taking into account the historical reality in which women continue to come to the mosque throughout the Islamic lands, even while these fatwa were being given, and so on and so forth, a whole host of considerations. And then you decide that, maybe this original legal ruling that the fuqaha gave, there's some scope to potentially reverse it, just as they expanded it. And so this is how fuqaha are meant to think. And the reason why we go through these legal meanings, and the reason why we try to drill them down and try to really articulate them, is because we want to understand how the fuqaha were thinking, so that we can begin thinking like them. And thinking like them doesn't mean you reach the same conclusion as them. It just means you recognize, okay, how were they reasoning through these issues? What were the considerations that they were taking into account? What were the factors that they were taking into account? And then when we reach a level where we're able to make judgments, then we can give judgments based on a similar reasoning process, but those judgments can be different in their conclusions. So another question, sorry, maybe I missed it. What is the judgment of reading Qur'an from Mus'haf in obligatory and recommended prayers? Well, with Abu Hanifa, it will invalidate your prayer. With Abu Yusuf Muhammad, it does not invalidate your prayer, but it is considered disliked. We might take that. I'm not sure if Imam al-Quduri mentions it in what nullifies or invalidates the prayer, but there's different legal reasoning mentioned for both positions. So Abu Hanifa, was it because he considered it excessive movement? Was it because he considered it to be a type of talaqqi or an instruction from an outsider, thus constituting a type of foreign act? And then with the Sahibain, their position of dislikingness, is it based on tashabbuh, which it seems to be, basically tashabbuh of other faiths? Does that illah, or does that legal cause still hold? Would it still constitute tashabbuh in salah, especially when half the Shafi'is are doing it? So we'll get into that, inshallah. Again, there's scope for it, because there's khilaf on it within the madhab, and there's khilaf on it between the madhab as well. And so there's no need to be too rigorous and gung-ho about this particular issue. So hopefully that clarifies that issue. Inshallah, we'll leave it at that then. Barakallahu feekum to everyone for coming, and inshallah I will see you all on Wednesday. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.